So again, welcome to the webinar. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Sarah Copeland. I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. We have just a few housekeeping notes as we get ready. You've joined with your audio and video disabled this morning. So if you need to ask any questions or need some technical assistance, we're going to ask you to use the chat and the Q&A functions today. Please do go ahead and introduce yourself in the meeting chat box with your name and your organization. If you have any technical problems or need assistance, also feel free to type that into the chat and we will help you out. We're going to use the Q&A button for questions during the webinar today. You can click on the Q&A button and then ask your question. We will get to all questions at the end of the webinar, at the end of the presentation. So if you can put your question there, we will make sure that it is answered. If you have any problems with the Q&A button, feel free to put your question in the meeting chat and we will move it over. We'll do our best to make sure every question is answered. This webinar is being recorded. At the beginning of next week, the presentation slides, the webinar recording, and the Q&A summary will be posted online on the project's website. So if there are any questions that you have or questions from yesterday's webinar, will be included in that Q&A. So again, please introduce yourself in the meeting chat box with your name and organization. If you can add questions as we go along there or in the Q&A box. And now I'd like to turn the webinar over to Tammy Alexander. Tammy is KDOT's Transportation Electrification Manager, and she'll be guiding us through the webinar today.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So I'm going to go over a few of the options for funding to support EV charging and give you some of the basics on that and our call for projects and how that will work. We're going to start off this morning with some clarification of charging infrastructure terminology to make sure that we're all on the same page when we're using certain terms. So if we're talking about a station location, that's going to refer to one address. Sometimes you've heard the individual chargers referred to as a charging station, but that's going to be an individual charger or a dispenser. A station is an actual address similar to a gas station where you might have multiple gas pumps, but it's one station. Same thing with an EV charging station. You might have multiple chargers, but it's one location. If you look here, this charging equipment on the left, there's one cable coming out of the left side of that charger. It's plugged into one vehicle. It's got one port. It can charge one vehicle at a time and only one connector, one type of connector. You see this charger on the right-hand side. There's one cable coming out of the left side charging one vehicle, but you see here there's two cables on the right. That's still only one port. It can charge one vehicle at a time. There's just two different connectors to connect to vehicles that might have a different charging port, but you can still only charge one vehicle on that right side, one vehicle on the left side. So this station here has 3 ports, but 4 connectors. Now looking at the different levels of charging, we'll go over some of that. Basically, if you're talking about a level 1 charging, that's going to be just a simple outlet that you might have in your garage. You can take the charging cord that was provided with your EV and plug it into any outlet in your garage, the same thing you would use to run power tools, blow dryer, space heater, etc. And you can charge your vehicle right in your garage, your carport, etc. If you have a short commute each day and you don't have a lot of miles that you drive, you can do most of your charging just on that regular outlet. No need for any additional equipment at your home. Most of the charging, over 80% of charging, is done at home, and it's very common that people just use this regular outlet in their garage or their parking area to charge their vehicle. Level 2 charging, that's going to be more similar to an electric clothes dryer, air conditioner, an electric stove. that 240 volt type of charging. It's common at workplaces for business fleets, a lot of public charging. Matter of fact, over 80% of public charging is that level 2 charging. And it's also could be installed in your garage. If you've got a longer commute each day and you need to charge more overnight than you can with a level 1 charger, you might want to install level 2 charging in your home. Or if you have 2 electric vehicles and so you're only charging maybe every other day because you're swapping between vehicles, level 2 charging is an option at home. DC fast charging is the type of charging that you would have along a highway. That's going to be very much similar to your gas station type experience, where you're going to stop in on a road trip, you're going to do a quick charge, and you're going to be back on your way. Typically, it requires 3-phase AC input, but you can supplement that sometimes with batteries if you have issues with that. Only about 15% of public charging ports are DC fast charging because it's not the type of charging that you use every day. And matter of fact, EV manufacturers generally advise you not to use it frequently because that super high speed charging is a little bit harder on your battery. And this is the type of charging that we're going to need along the corridors for the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure funding. So currently there are 3 funding opportunities that are available for EV charging. There's the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure funding. That's funding that's available from the U.S. Department of Transportation through Federal Highways Administration. It supports alternative fuel infrastructure along the designated alternative fuel corridors for electric, hydrogen, natural gas, and propane fueling. There's also some support for off-corridor and community charging and fueling infrastructure. Applications are due to the Federal Highway Administration by May 30th, and you can find more information on grants.gov, and I'll go into it a little bit more in this presentation as well. Then there's the National Electric Vehicle, or NEVI, formula funds. The states were each allocated funding for EV infrastructure along federally designated EV charging corridors. KDOT has been allocated funding for that, and so we're doing our call for projects for that funding, as well as additional funding that has been allocated to KDOT from the federal government that can support EV infrastructure for off-corridor and community EV charging. That will also be part of our call for projects. So the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure funding. This is a federal program that is administered by the Federal Highway Administration through the US DOT. This is not through KDOT. You'll have to apply directly to them. There's been $700 million allocated this year. Who wants to support corridor and community charging and fueling infrastructure. There's $350 million for corridor, $350 million for community. There's a single application for both the programs, and you can be awarded under both programs at once. For the community grants, there's a minimum of a $500,000 award with a max of $15 million. Corridor grants have a minimum of $1 million, but no maximum. It does require, like most federal programs, a 20% local cash match, and they must be publicly accessible fueling. You can find more information at that website, and we will share these slides after the webinar today, so they'll be available on the Charge Up Kansas website, and so you can access those links. Eligible applicants for the charging and fueling infrastructure funding are states or subdivisions of states, MPOs, local governments, special transportation districts, Indian tribes, U.S. territories, and agencies or groups of the above entities. In addition, for the community program, state and local authorities who manage transportation facilities are also eligible. And again, this will have to be applied for directly through the federal grants.gov outlet, not through KDOT. KDOT also does not plan to submit an application for the funding. But we can provide you some assistance on the applications if you need some information for your application. If you contact us by May 15th, we can assist with Charge Up Kansas NEVI plan components. Some of those are a requirement if you're applying for corridor charging, et cetera. So we can send maps, tables, et cetera. We can give you some contact information or provide you a letter of support. So please reach out to chargeupks@ks.gov and we can help you out. We cannot, however, provide any assistance with writing or submitting the application. You'll have to manage that through another outlet. Okay, the NEVI formula funding. The NEVI formula funds were distributed to each of the state DOTs from the federal government, and the state DOTs are administering their programs individually. KDOT has over 14 million available under this current call for projects. That's equivalent to the first 2 years of funding under the NEVI program. It is limited to designated EV corridors to build new or update existing stations to the new NEVI requirements. Those corridors must be fully built out before we can use the funding in other areas such as community charging or off-corridor charging. Corridor charging requires 4 150 kilowatt CCS ports every 50 miles within 1 mile of the corridor. And Justice 40 initiative requirements will apply, where 40% of the funding needs to benefit disadvantaged communities. For this EV charging funding, communities without access to EV charging are included, which includes a lot of our rural communities. So this is a great help for Kansas, and we shouldn't have any issues with meeting that 40%. There is a minimum 20% local cash match required for the projects. So for the NEVI formula funds, eligible applicants are basically anyone who wants to put their funding towards developing a public charging station. That's private businesses, nonprofits, educational institutions, MPO, local governments, Indian tribes, and any authorities, agencies, or groups of the above. So those designated EV corridors in Kansas, they're shown here on this map with those brown dashed lines, and then that section between Topeka and Kansas City, that's a green, solid green line. You can see the purple dots on this map. That shows where we currently have existing NEVI compliant stations. We have them in 5 locations around the state. So you can see we have a little bit of work to do, but it's not as bad as it quite looks from that map. We do have additional DC fast charging along our interstates. And so you can see those locations on this map. In addition to the existing locations, you can see some of those red areas there where there's DC fast charging that is currently under construction. Most of those locations should be open sometime this summer. But again, you can see those orange dashed lines. Those are the locations of the EV charging corridors throughout the state, and they're eligible for this NEVI funding to install the NEVI compliant charging stations. This map, the red sections show the KDOT priority areas for where we would like to have NEVI funded stations installed. If you look at the map, you can see the green rectangles with the numbers. They show the mile markers of the beginning and end points of those priority areas. For instance, there in western Kansas, the priority area would be from the Colorado line to mile marker 70 along mile marker 30 along I-70. And then from mile marker 79 to mile marker 139 along I-70. Continuing across the state, and the same for the other corridors. Looking at some of our metropolitan areas, you can see here on the Wichita inset, our priority areas for US 400 will be west of the US 400 235 junction and east of the US 400 K96 junction, all of I-135, and then I-35 south of mile marker, I believe it's 43 on this previous map. Yes, south of mile marker 43 in Wichita. In Topeka, there is a NEVI compliant station in Topeka that's serving I-70 and some of I-30 of 335. Those corridors are eligible, but they're just not our priority areas. In Kansas City, you can see along I-35, we do have some DC fast charging, but none of them are NEVI compliant. So I-35 and I-70 in the Kansas City area are both part of our priority areas for NEVI compliant DC fast charging stations. So the formula program location requirements, there's very specific requirements handed down from the federal government that we have to meet for these stations. Section 7 and 8 of our Charge Up Kansas NEVI plan, they outline how we selected our priorities for DC fast charging. First of all, there were gaps along designated EV charging corridor where we don't have existing EV charging, or excuse me, DC fast charging. Then we will support upgrades to existing charging stations, and then support for community applications to the discretionary funding for EV charging, such as the charging and fueling infrastructure funding and the additional funding that we've identified. Stations must be publicly accessible 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and preferably are within 1 mile driving distance of an EV charging corridor. We can request exceptions for that 1 mile distance, but we have to give supporting information for why we need to exceed that 1 mile distance. The locations must have dusk to dawn lighting, restroom facilities, basic shelter for inclement weather, and access to cellular data service or Wi-Fi. This because they must be network chargers, so they have to be able to access the internet for networking, and for customers to be able to access customer service should they need assistance with the chargers. Additional amenities such as food service, shopping, and our entertainment are a plus. And you can see section 8.1 of the Charge Up Kansas NEVI plan for more details on some of that. Additional requirements for ADA accessibility apply. And you can see section 9.1 of the Charge Up Kansas NEVI plan, and I'll also go into the ADA accessibility requirements a little bit later in this webinar. Stations must be open for a minimum of 5 years and meet 97% uptime. The minimum station requirements are that each location have 4 CCS ports capable of simultaneously charging at 150 kilowatts or more at 250 to 920 volts DC. They must be Buy American compliant UL certified equipment installed by certified technicians. Technicians can be certified under the Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Training Program, EVITP, or another continuing education certificate from a registered apprenticeship. Stations must provide a contactless payment method that accepts major credit or debit cards through an automated toll-free line or text message. They cannot require an app or offer a discount through a charging app. Prices for charging must be displayed prior to initiating a charging transaction, and they need to be based on the price per kilowatt hour to charge. There are data sharing requirements and hardware requirements for the vehicle chargers. There's reporting requirements for a minimum of 5 years, and you can find more information on these requirements in the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Standards and Requirements webpage. And again, we will share these slides out so that you can access those links. Allowable costs under the NEVI formula program include EV charging infrastructure and necessary equipment and installation costs to connect it to a network to facilitate data collection, access, and reliability, including upgrades to existing public charging stations to meet new NEVI formula requirements, and on-site distributed energy source resources such as solar arrays or batteries as needed to support the station. There's additional costs that are allocable to operating and maintaining the EV charging infrastructure for up to 5 years. That's going to include extended warranties, maintenance programs, etc. On-site and right-of-way signage for EV charging acquired or installed under the program. You can find further details on allowable costs at the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program Guidance webpage. In addition to the NEVI funding, KDOT has identified some other funding that was allocated to the state, and that can be used to support EV charging for communities and off of these EV charging corridors. So the eligible applicants for that funding include local governments, tribal governments, nonprofits, educational institutions, and then agencies or groups of the above. There will be multiple funding pools of this funding available that will be allocated specifically to cities with populations under 5,000, cities with populations of 5,001 to 4,999, and then additional funding that can be used statewide in other areas. So we definitely encourage the small communities to apply. The requirements for this off-corridor and community EV charging, they must also have a minimum of 4 charging ports per site. However, they can be a AC level 2 charging or DC fast charging or a combination of both. The level 2 charging must meet a minimum of 6 kilowatts per port with the J1772 connectors. DC fast charging, we think may need to be a minimum of 150 kilowatts per port. They do have to have CCS connectors, but we're still clarifying if the off-corridor charging needs to meet that 150 kilowatts minimum. Some of the guidance we've received is not super clear, so we're reaching out to the Joint Office to get clarification on that. The equipment must be Buy America compliant and UL certified and installed by certified technicians under that EVITP or continuing education programs. There is a waiver currently available for some of those Buy America requirements, and I'll go into that later. The locations must be open to the public and accessible at least as frequently as the business hours of the site host, but they do encourage chargers to be open as long as they are physically accessible. For instance, if they're installed at a location that's open maybe from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m., the chargers need to be accessible at least that long, but they do encourage that they be open, that they be usable even longer than those hours if possible. In addition, these installations will need to meet ADA accessibility requirements. And this is our corridor plan that was developed a few years ago across the state. And you can see that there are lots of locations around the state where we would know that we need to install DC fast charging that aren't currently on an EV charging corridor. So many of these locations, we would encourage you to apply and respond to the call for projects so that you could be included in this off-corridor and community charging. In addition to DC fast charging, we know there's needs for level 2 charging in communities at various community offices, multi-unit housing, etc. So the call for projects process. Again, this applies just to the NEVI funds and the community and corridor charging. If you're interested in the charging and fueling infrastructure funding, you'll need to apply through the Federal Highways portal. Okay, the waiver of Buy America requirements. It does waive through June 30th of next year. It waives the iron and steel rules for components and the domestic cost components for the chargers manufactured in the US. They have to be manufactured before June 30th, and they must begin installation before October 1st of 2024. After that date, the waiver applies to EV chargers for which the cost of the components manufactured in the US exceeds 55%. There's currently no end date on the waiver, but Federal Highways is going to take a look at it every 6 months and then again at the 5-year mark to see if it's still in need, etc. The waiver only applies to federally funded AC level 2 and DC fast chargers and does not include the housing components of the chargers. So the exterior components, the housing, they still have to meet standard Buy America requirements for iron and steel. The housing is the outer housing enclosures of the cabinet or the deployed components. An EV charger only means the unit itself. It does not include associated electrical equipment that are external to the charger. They will still need to meet the typical Buy America requirements. And you can find more information on the federal website at the waiver for Buy America requirements. And again, we will share these slides out so that you can have those links. ADA accessibility is a requirement for the EV charging stations, and we recommend that you use US Access Board design recommendations for electric vehicle charging stations. If you have EV charging stations at any of these locations, state or local government offices, public parks, municipal building parking lots, street parking, public right-of-way, residential housing provided by the state or local government, public EV charging stations provided by private entities or at rest stops along the interstates, you need to the ADA accessibility requirements apply. So our project concept form, as you can see, this is a simple form, 2-page form. We want your basic information, the location that you're looking to install the charging, some basic information at the number of ports and the type of charging level, the type of charging that you want, level 2, DC fast charging, a proposed start date and a completion date, and some basic information about the type of dirt work that might be required. And this tell us a little bit about your location. Is it a park? Is it a convenience store? Is it an office building, etc.? And if you have some estimated project costs, you can include those. In addition, any additional information that you might have about the project, photos, maps, drawings, etc. This can be as simple as a Google satellite, Google Earth image, and you might circle on the area. Hey, this is where we're looking at installing the chargers. So if you have any questions, you can direct those to chargeupks@ks.gov. Your project concept form needs to be submitted by May the 5th of this year. And you do need to submit a project concept form to be eligible for the funding. So our timeline on this call for projects, the call for projects was announced last week. That form is available on our website. May 5th will be the deadline to submit those project concept forms. And again, you must submit a project concept form in order to be eligible for the funding. Technical assistance will be provided throughout May and early June to assist those potential project sponsors and give you information about the funding opportunities and help you tweak your applications. We will send out applications the week of June 5th to those approved project sponsors who submitted project concept forms, and those full applications will be due July 21st. We anticipate that awards will be announced in September. And this page has several links to helpful resources that I've referenced throughout this webinar. Again, we will share these slides out so that you will have these links and be able to access this information. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
So if anyone joining us today has a question for Tammy, you can put it in the Q&A box, or if you have problems with the Q&A box, feel free to add that to the chat. We don't have any questions right now, so I'll just give you a minute or two to see if there are any questions to be submitted. Again, as a reminder, the recording of this webinar, the presentation slides, and our Q&A summary from yesterday's webinar as well as today will be posted on the project website next week. Are there any questions for Tammy today? Okay, so we have a couple of questions here. One question is about the call for projects itself. Tammy, can you clarify whether community charging is any funds for community charging are included in this call for projects?
Yes, there is funding for community charging in this call for projects. This call for projects is for two pots of funding. We have our NEVI formula funding, which will support charging along the alternative fuel corridors. And then we have another pot of funding that KDOT has identified to use for charging in communities and for locations off corridors. So it's the same call for projects form that you'll need to fill out to be eligible for both. If you're interested in that separate charging and fueling infrastructure funding through federal highways, you will need to fill out their form.
There's also a question here about eligible applicants. It appears the project concept form is for site owners. Can you speak to who's eligible to apply?
For the NEVI funding, it's pretty much anyone who's willing to develop DC fast charging that's publicly available. For the community charging and the off-corridor charging, it's going to be your nonprofits, city and county governments, any institute of local government, tribal governments, educational institutions. Did I say nonprofits? That's who will be eligible.
Are utilities eligible for the NEVI program, for the community, the CFI program, or other alternative programs?
Utilities would be eligible for the NEVI program. For the CFI program, no, I don't believe they are. For the community funding that KDOT has identified, it would depend on the type of utility. If they're a nonprofit utility such as a co-op, yes, they would be eligible. If they're an investor-owned utility, they would not.
For facilities, if there are no public restrooms, can the facility be included in a funding request?
For the NEVI funding, the corridor charging, public restrooms have to be. For the community charging or the off-corridor charging, it's not a requirement.
Um,
To address that question, I think it's, can the restrooms be added to the project? And that would be a no.
Oh, yes.
The only thing the funding is eligible has to be directly related to the end result, which is a charging station for the electric vehicles.
Right. Sorry, I misunderstood. Yes, we cannot fund the building of the restrooms, but they would be a necessity to be accessible at the NEVI funded stations. So I hope that answers the question. If not, please drop in the chat and we'll try to answer that better. Thank you, Matt. I missed that.
So here's a question about eligible costs. Are utility transformers and wiring to the EV station an allowable cost?
If it is directly attributable to the EV charging station, and that specifically for that location, if not, no. However, there is additional funding available under the bipartisan infrastructure law through other federal opportunities that can support that type of grid upgrades that are necessary. And so we would encourage them to pursue some of that funding for some of those costs.
We have a couple of questions about project concept forms. One is about the costs. Are the budget costs included in the project concept form expected to be final costs, or can cost estimates be finalized in the full application?
Yes, you can just put estimates on your project concept form. And for that matter, if you don't have any of those, that's fine as well on the project concept form. Just, share what you have. And then when we send the final applications out, then you'll be able to put together your final projected budget at that point.
Okay, and follow-up question is, once someone has submitted a project concept, how do they know that it has been received by KDOT? Is there any kind of confirmation?
No, it doesn't automatically send a confirmation, but that is something that we could probably add to say, yes, we've received your form. So,
Right,
And
and
then,
every entity that submits a concept form is going to have direct communication through that whole technical assistance one-on-one
yeah.
process. So all will be made aware.
and then to follow up from that, what are the criteria or requirements from the project concept in order to be invited to make a full application?
Well, we'll just want to have like a basic idea of what you're looking at for charging. And then we can work with you on some of the specifics for your charging station, and give you a better idea of what you might need to change to be more competitive. But basically,
So
I mean, it's those minimum requirements that we've listed.
yeah, mainly it's for ensuring eligibilities, and then also giving each interested sponsor an opportunity to have a little bit more insight as to what would make their each proposal more competitive.
This question is about off-corridor stations. Do you know approximate costs involved in off-corridor EV charging?
I do not, because we haven't looked into that as closely. I will say off corridor, unless you're looking at the same, 150 kilowatt ports, it's going to be significantly less expensive, specifically if you're looking at level 2 charging. That's significantly less expensive. But I don't really have any estimates for off corridor. It would kind of depend on what they were looking at installing. I guess as a reference, we're looking at probably these NEVI compliant corridor stations would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 750,000 to 1.2 million for an installation. So
Yeah, on and off corridor isn't where the cost varies. It's charging level types,
right.
amount of chargers that you'd want in place at a station.
And any grid upgrades that might be necessary.
Okay, I think we might be coming to the end of the questions for today. We'll wait just a moment to see if there are any additional questions. Again, we'll remind everyone that the webinar recording, the presentation slides, and the Q&A summary will be posted on the project website next week. We have added the link to the website into the chat and the Q&A box, but we will drop it in one more time in case you need it. Are there any final questions for today? Oh, and there's the link also.
There was a request to show the slide related to the community programmer information. Was there any specific question about that one? Because these will be made available next week as well.
This one, I hope that's the right
Shut up.
slide that they're looking at. The map, okay. There we go. I will say this is not an all-inclusive map. These are locations that we identified based on traffic, where we felt that DC fast charging would be supportive of the state's travel patterns. However, for the community and off-corridor charging, anywhere in the state would be eligible. This also doesn't include, this is for DC fast charging. This is not level 2 needs, which will be needed pretty much everywhere.
There is a question here, Tammy, about whether there is a matrix that summarizes the differences between the 3 programs in terms of eligible applicants or costs, corridor versus off corridor. Is there any kind of summary that you can point people to?
There is information on the charging and fueling infrastructure grant at their website, which is there. And we can put together a matrix for the NEVI program and the community in off-corridor grants and add that to the website, the Charge Up Kansas website.
There's also a question about whether there will be an RFP for vendors looking to assist with infrastructure for the entire project.
We don't have any plans to do something like that.
I believe that that is the end of the questions. So again, if we've missed your question or there's additional information, we will post a Q&A summary on the project website next week. And Tammy, if you'd like to go back to that final slide, if you have another question after the webinar ends, you can send those to chargeupks@ks.gov. Tammy, any final comments?
No, just thank you everyone for joining us, and I look forward to seeing all of your projects.